The gate had not changed. That was the first shock of it, and perhaps the cruelest. 6 years she had been away. 6 years of Belgian winters and borrowed candlelight in the particular silence of rooms that were not hers, and she had half expected to find the world reshaped in her absence. The gateposts of Ashmore moved, the iron worn to rust. The stone of the old west pillar finally surrendered to the ivy that had been threatening it since her childhood. Instead, the gate stood exactly as it had stood on the October morning. Her father pressed her hand and helped her into the hired carriage, and her breath left her with a small sound she did not intend. The house rose beyond the gravel drive, pale stone against a sky the color of pewter, and every window was lit. Someone had planted new roses along the east terrace. Her father had always meant to plant them, and the sight of them, red and late and somehow still flowering in the cold, was so particular a grief that she had to stand very still at the gate. She was 24 years old. She had no money that counted, no letter of credit, no bag beyond the worn leather satchel on her shoulder. What she had was the cameo brooch she wore, tucked inside her collar against her throat, its pin clasp grown smooth from 6 years of being taken out and held in the dark when she needed to remember that she had once existed here. Her father had pressed it into her palm the morning she left. She had carried it across the Channel and through the low, cold rooms of the Harcourt household in Brussels, and back across the Channel again, and she carried it still. She knocked at the gate. The gatehousekeeper who opened the small side door was a boy she did not know, no more than 16, his face wide and blank with the boredom of a cold afternoon post. He looked at her and said nothing, waiting. "I am Miss Ashmore," she said. "I have come home." The boy's expression did not change in a way that suggested recognition. It changed in a way that suggested she had said something faintly peculiar. "I'll fetch someone," he said, and disappeared. She waited 4 minutes. She counted them by the breath of wind along the drive, and by the way the late roses on the east terrace moved in it. When the great door of the house opened, and a woman appeared on the steps, Elspeth's first thought was that she did not know her. Her second thought was that the woman was walking toward the gate with the exact particular ease of a person who had learned to walk toward things as though they already belonged to her. She was perhaps 2 years older than Elspeth, dark-haired, dressed in a morning gown of soft blue wool that suited the house in the way that garments suit houses only when they have been chosen specifically for that purpose. Her face was pleasant, open, carefully warm, and her smile, when it appeared at roughly 20 yards, so that it would be fully assembled by the time she arrived, was practiced and plausible, and carried nothing behind it. "Can I help you?" the woman said. Her tone was the tone of a hostess addressing a stranger, kind, and entirely without purchase. Elspeth looked at her and understood very clearly what had happened while she was gone. "My name is Elspeth Ashmore," she said. "My father was Edmund Ashmore, who died in the spring of 1814. I was sent abroad in October of 1810, and I've been in Brussels these past 6 years in the service of the Harcourt family. I have come home." The woman's smile did not change. That was the thing Elspeth would think about afterward, in the long, sleepless hours of that first night in the house. The smile did not change at all. It simply stayed affixed, patient, while the woman's eyes ran a quick, private inventory of Elspeth's worn pelisse and her old leather satchel and her boots that had been resoled once in Brussels and once in Calais. "How distressing for you," the woman said at last, "to have traveled so far under such a misapprehension. Miss Ashmore has been gone these 6 years. Perhaps you knew her." Before a small, considered pause, "My name is Cecily Frome. I am a companion of the household. Do come in, out of the cold." She opened the gate herself, and her hand was very steady on the latch. The house smelled the same. Beeswax and old stone, and the faint ghost of her father's pipe tobacco, which should have been long gone, but which she thought she could detect in the corridor, in the way one detects a perfume that has soaked into the very plaster. She followed Cecily Frome through a hallway lined with portraits she recognized, past the morning room door, past the blue and white Dutch tiles her father had carried from London at great expense, and installed himself over 3 days with a persistence that had driven the housekeeper half to distraction. Elspeth had been 9 years old. She had sat on the corridor floor and passed him each tile in turn, and he had pressed them into the setting plaster with his thumbs and declared the whole enterprise worth every inconvenience. The tiles were still there. She did not let herself look at them directly. She noted with the careful attention of someone cataloging evidence that none of the furniture had been moved, only augmented. A new writing desk near the window. New curtains in the morning room, yellow where her mother's had been green. The pier glass in the front passage had been reframed in gilt, which her father would not have liked. The small chair by the fire in the hallway, the chair where she had sat with her governess through years of cold season mornings, had been moved to the far wall and positioned as decoration rather than use, angled just slightly, as chairs are positioned when they have been recategorized as furniture. She had been placed to wait in the small blue anteroom while Cecily consulted the household as to what was to be done with her, and she sat there with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned over 6 years to occupy borrowed space without troubling it. The anteroom was papered in the same faded blue she remembered, and the window overlooked the east garden, where the late October grass had gone the particular gray gold of neglect. The beds untended since whoever had last tended them had ceased to do so. Her mother had kept those beds. Her mother had known the name of every plant in them, and had spoken those names to Elspeth as other mothers spoke prayers, which was to say with a reverence that was entirely natural to the speaker, and which the child had absorbed without understanding what she was absorbing. She heard Lady Prescott before she heard her carriage, which was the usual order of things. The woman's voice carried from the gate before her wheels had finished on the gravel, and Elspeth pressed back slightly against the wall, not hiding, simply making herself less visible to the window, and listened. Lady Prescott spoke in the carrying tones of a woman who had never once considered moderating her volume. "That poor wandering creature at the gate, yesterday," Lady Prescott said, and Elspeth could hear the thread of amused sympathy in it, the kind of sympathy that requires an audience. "Some ghost the children have conjured, most like. The servants will talk Sicily. You know they always do. I hope Viscount Ashmore has been sensible about it." At the sound of that title, Elspeth's hand went still on the arm of the chair. She had known, in the abstract, that the estate would have passed to the entail when her father died with no living heir. She had not let herself think very precisely about what that meant, in terms of the man currently occupying the house. She heard Cecily's reply, lower, soothing. She could not make out the words, but she could hear the shape of them, the measured reassurance of a woman managing another woman's anxiety, with the efficiency of long practice. And then she heard a third voice, brief, level, a man's. "Thank you, Lady Prescott. The matter is in hand." There was a quality to those 7 words that she could not yet name. They were not warm. They were not cold in the way of carelessness. They were cold in the way of a man who has learned that warmth costs something he can no longer afford. The door to the anteroom opened, and she stood. He was tall, 30 or so, with dark hair worn short in the fashion, and a face that held its expression the way stone holds its shape under water, all form and no yield. He looked at her with the careful attention of someone who has learned to look at everything carefully, and she felt the weight of that gaze the way one feels the weight of a held breath. "Miss," he said. "My lord," she said. "I am the daughter of Edmund Ashmore. I was born in this house 6 years before you were entitled to it. I have returned to establish that fact." He did not flinch. He did not disbelieve her visibly. He simply regarded her for a moment, with those careful gray eyes, and said, "Come to the steward's office." It was not an invitation. It was the kind of sentence that had been, for some years, an instruction. She showed him the cameo in the steward's office. It was a small oval portrait, brooch with its carved ivory face and its gold pin. The monogram E.A. worked into the back in the old style her father had favored. She held it out in her palm and watched his face. And she saw something happen there, a small, precise event, quickly contained the way a man suppresses a response that surprises him. The steward's office was a small room at the back of the house, south-facing, with a single window that looked onto the kitchen garden. It smelled of account books, and the particular dry dustiness of a room that sees a great deal of practical work and no decorative attention. He had been standing when she entered, and he remained standing because the desk between them was narrow, and the room was narrow, and sitting would have required either one of them to move in a way that reduced the distance. He kept the distance carefully. He reached across the desk, not to take the brooch, but to open the inventory ledger that sat there, the estate's record of household property. He turned pages with a practiced hand. Unhurried, a man accustomed to finding things in ledgers by knowing roughly where they would be, he stopped at an entry and read it. His face did not change in the way of faces that are making an effort not to change. He read it again. The room was very quiet. Outside the kitchen garden window, the wind moved through what remained of the late season's cabbages. She could hear her own breathing, and she regulated it with the same deliberate care with which she had been regulating all her visible responses since the gate. He closed the ledger without speaking and looked at her, and his gray eyes held something that was not yet belief, and was not disbelief either, but was the thing that sits between them when a man discovers that what he has accepted as fact and what is actually true may not be the same. She did not look away. She had not come this far. To look away from a man who was finally looking at her, the pulse in her throat was very loud. She doubted he could see it. She was not certain he could not. "I will provide you a room," he said. "The east wing, separate from the main house. I will send for Mr. Rowe, who handled your father's estate." "Mr. Rowe," she said, "will have received a letter from me 4 years ago, and another 2 years ago, neither of which produced any reply." His jaw tightened, slightly, and then released. "Nevertheless," he said, "she was given the east wing room. It was comfortable and clean, and utterly stripped of anything that had ever been hers. Someone had removed every last personal item, every book with a name inscribed, every pair of worn shoes, every piece of her girlhood. The room had been made into a guest room with the completeness of a room that was meant never to remember being anything else. Cicely's objection to the arrangement had been quiet, precisely calibrated. Delivered in the corridor outside Marcus's study. "My lord, I only say for your own protection that bringing an unknown woman into the house without verification is the kind of generosity that is sometimes taken advantage of." Her voice was warm with concern. Her hands were folded before her with the stillness of someone who has decided something and is waiting for the world to catch up. She did not know, Elspeth thought, that Marcus Vane had already seen the entry in the inventory ledger. She did not know that he was already, with the subdued precision of a man who does not waste motion looking. She found the schoolroom by instinct on the second afternoon when the house was quiet and Cecily was occupied with Lady Prescott's return call downstairs. She told herself she had no particular reason to go there. She went anyway up the back stairs, past the familiar turn in the corridor with its crooked floorboard, to the door at the end that opened onto a small south-facing room with 2 dormer windows and a window seat that had been recushioned in pale green. She sat in it. The light was low and late, the October sun already pulling away toward the horizon, and the room smelled of chalk dust and wood, and the particular quiet of a room that has not been a schoolroom for some years. She ran her hand along the inner edge of the window seat's wooden frame, where the cushion ended and the bare wood began, and she found what she was looking for by feel. The letters she had carved there herself at the age of 11, with a small knife she had taken from the kitchen and returned before her governess noticed. EEA. Her own initials, still sharp, still perfectly legible. She was tracing the A with the tip of her finger when she understood there was someone in the doorway. She did not look up immediately. She finished the trace, the slow, deliberate circuit of the letter her 11-year-old self had cut into a piece of wood she had considered permanent, and hers, and then she looked. Viscount Ashmore stood in the doorway. He had not announced himself, and he did not speak. He looked at her sitting in the window seat with her hand on the carved letters, and his face held the expression of a man who has just understood something he had been refusing to articulate. He said nothing. After a moment, he left. That evening, she encountered him in the corridor outside the small parlor, and he held the door open without speaking, and she understood. This was an invitation to speak privately, where Cecily could not arrive without warning. The parlor was cold. The fire had been laid but not yet lit. She sat. He stood near the window with his arms crossed, and his gaze on the unlit grate, and she told him about it all. Brussels, the Harcourt household, the 6 years of letters dispatched into apparent silence, the careful frugality of a woman who had no access to what was rightfully hers and knew it. She told him about the false letter that had sent her abroad to begin with, a summons in her father's hand that she now understood had been manufactured, a letter saying that a relative in France required her attendance, and that she should come quickly and tell no one until she had gone. She had been 18. She had gone. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, still looking at the cold grate. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "As though you believe I will act on it. I have been managing this estate for 4 years on the basis of documentation that said you were dead, because—" She said, "You have not sent for the magistrate, which is what Cecily wants you to do. And because in the steward's office yesterday, when I showed you the cameo, you opened the inventory ledger and you looked at something that changed your face." He was quiet again. Longer this time. "The brooch appears in the estate records," he said. "My Lord Ashmore gave it to his daughter on the occasion of her departure. In October of 1810, its description matches precisely." He looked at her at last, and she saw it then, the thing he had been containing. Not hostility, not disbelief, but a kind of controlled fear. The fear of a man who has learned that caring what is true can cost him things he cannot recover. "I have been deceived before," he said. "On a matter of considerable weight, I find I am cautious." She did not ask him to say more. He told her anyway, in the spare, careful language of a man who rarely speaks of such things at all. A wife named Catherine, 3 years ago. Childbirth. A child. He had believed, for 4 days, that both of them might survive. He had allowed himself to believe it. And then on the 5th morning the physician had come down the stairs with his face arranged in the particular way that physicians arrange their faces when there is nothing left to arrange, and Marcus had understood in that moment the exact cost of having allowed himself to believe anything at all. "I have learned," he said, "that believing someone is alive does not make it so, and I have learned that losing that belief a second time would unmake what little remains of me." He said it level, without self-pity, the way one states a fact about load-bearing walls. "This is what holds the structure. Therefore this cannot be touched." She did not say anything immediately. Outside the parlor window, the October wind moved through the late roses on the terrace, and the sound of it was like water, like time, like something that had been running a very long while. She thought about the 5 days he had described, the 4 days of allowing himself to believe. The 5th morning on the stairs. She thought about her own 6 years of letters dispatched into silence, of waking in Brussels in rooms that smelled of Belgian winter and foreign wood fires, and believing, each morning, that the silence was not permanent, that someone somewhere in England still held the space she had vacated, that the believing made the space real. They had both been learning the same lesson, she thought, and arriving at opposite conclusions from it. "I am not asking you to believe it on faith," she said. "I am asking you to look at the evidence as though it were a matter of estate law, rather than of personal history. You are accustomed, I suspect, to making decisions on insufficient information." Something that was almost nothing flickered in his face, very briefly, and was gone. "Write to Mr. Rowe," she said. The dinner party was Cecily's idea and Cecily's arrangement, and Elspeth knew it from the moment the invitations went out, though she was not consulted. Lady Prescott was invited, and the Fairfax family from King's Hollow, and 2 other couples whose names she did not yet know, and Josiah Frome, who arrived from the village with the contained satisfaction of a man come to watch the conclusion of a thing he had set in motion years before. She had not known, until that night, what he looked like. He was older than she expected, gray-haired, compact, with the careful watchfulness of someone who has spent a long time managing other people's property and has grown to think of management as ownership. He did not look at her directly across the table. He looked at a point slightly to her left, the way people look at things they have decided are not quite there. The dinner was gracious, the candles bright, the long table set with the Ashmore silver that she remembered her father polishing on winter afternoons when the steward was occupied elsewhere, and he felt the domestic urge take him. 8 branches of candles, the firelight from the east wall. The particular quality of candlelit air in a dining room that has been warmed for hours before the guests arrived. The way it softens every edge and makes the room seem, from the outside, like a painting of itself. Cecily had arranged the seating with surgical precision. Elspeth sat between 2 people who did not know her. Mr. Fairfax on her left, a pleasant man who wished to discuss the harvest, and on her right, a Mrs. Brest Aldred who seemed unaware of the current situation and wished only to discuss her niece's upcoming presentation at court. Across from Elspeth, with the width of the table between them and the silver candelabra throwing its light upward into the planes of his face, sat Josiah. He had positioned his wine-glass carefully. He had positioned himself carefully. She thought the containment of the man was very complete. Marcus sat at the head of the table. He was attentive and formally polite, in the way of a man who has learned that formal politeness is a thing one can sustain almost indefinitely, if the alternative is worse. He spoke to Lady Prescott about the hunting, to Mr. Deddy, Fairfax about the harvest, to Mrs. Aldred about London, and his eyes moved across the table with the regular careful attention of a host who has been responsible for rooms long enough that he monitors them without appearing to. He did not speak to Elspeth until the fish course, when he asked her from across the table whether she had found Brussels a congenial city. She knew it was not a social question. It was the kind of question that has been constructed from its answer outward, shaped to give her the opening to speak in specifics that could later be verified by anyone who cared to write to Belgium. She answered him fully. The Harcourt household on the Rue du Bois. The 3 children, their names, their ages, their lessons, which she named, one by one with the precision of someone for whom those 6 years had been the whole of her visible world. The English church in the Rue Royale, where the expatriate community gathered on Sunday mornings. The cold of the Belgian winter of 1812, which had been unlike any cold she had experienced, not simply a matter of temperature but of quality, a cold that had opinions about the people it found in it. She watched Marcus listen. She watched Cecily listen. What? She watched Josiah's gaze shift very slightly toward her at the mention of the Harcourt family's name, a small movement of recalculation, the kind a man makes when a detail he had not expected enters an account he had believed closed. His hands on the table did not move, only the eyes, and only fractionally. It was after the removes, when the cloth had been changed, and the conversation had settled into the easy proprietary flow of people comfortable in a room they considered theirs, that Cecily produced the document. She did it quietly. She drew it from the small drawer of the sideboard where it had been waiting, and she placed it on the table near Josiah's elbow. And she said in a voice that was regretful and measured and performed with tremendous skill, "I am sorry to bring this into the evening, my lord. It must be said so that you are protected." It was a document from a Belgian magistrate, bearing what appeared to be an official seal, attesting to the death of one Elspeth Ann Ashmore, age 22, in Brussels in the winter of 1816, of a fever. It named the street, the household, the attending physician. Josiah read it with a nod that was too ready, the nod of a man who has seen the document before. Cecily looked at Elspeth across the candlelight, and the smile was still there, still perfectly assembled, and she said, with a sort of compassionate firmness, "She is nothing but a ghost. You have let in from the cold, my lord, and ghosts do not inherit." The room was very quiet. Marcus looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. He did not look at Elspeth, and that was the thing she would carry back up the stairs with her, the cold, particular weight of it. He did not look at her. She folded her napkin and placed it at the side of her plate, and she stood, and she excused herself with the formal courtesy her father had taught her was the correct response to a room that has decided to erase you, and she walked out. She sat on the cold stairs outside the main corridor. For a time she did not measure. The cameo brooch was in her hand. She had not planned to reach for it. Her hand had simply found it inside her collar, with the same instinct with which it had found it in every dark room of the past 6 years, closing around it before her mind had formed the intention. The staircase was the back stair, the servant's stair, narrow and stone-floored, and the cold of it came up through her shoes in a way that she noticed without minding. She was 24 years old, and she had spent 6 years being cold, in rooms that were not hers, and she had learned the specific discipline of allowing cold to be just cold without loading it with meaning. She thought about Marcus at the table, the way he had looked at the document for a long time without looking at her. She had read that stillness correctly. She was almost certain of it. Not disbelief in her, but the cost of belief, the known cost of it. The way a man who has burned his hand on a stove learns to stand at a specific distance from heat. She had read it correctly. She was almost certain. What she was less certain of was whether it mattered. She sat for some time with the brooch in her palm and that question in her chest, and the cold came up through the stones, and the house above her made the particular sounds of a house that has been occupied for many generations and has grown comfortable with its own settling. She was not going to run. She had understood that much before the dessert course, in the moment when Cecily produced the document, and she felt the room's attention shift like weather, the social atmosphere moving away from her all at once, with the smooth efficiency of a crowd that has been told where to look. She had been running for 6 years, moving from room to room, household to household, city to city, carrying herself with the careful economy of a woman who cannot afford to misplace anything that belongs to her. She was done with it. She had come home, and she intended to remain. She went, when the house quieted around midnight, to the estate library. She had not been in it since her return. The library was the room most likely to contain the records she needed, and she had also been most afraid of what she would find. She went now with the steadiness of someone who has already absorbed the worst of the evening, and found they are still standing. The library smelled of leather and tallow and the particular dry quiet of old paper. She lit the lamp at the desk and began with the inheritance documents, the folder her father's solicitor would have prepared at his death. She found the folder still labeled in a clerk's hand. She opened it. Several pages had been removed. The gaps were visible. Cut edges of paper, precise, clean, the work of someone who knew which documents were damning and had time to do the work neatly. She stood looking at the gaps for a moment, and then she began quietly to examine the rest. She found it in the back binding of the accounting ledger for 1810, folded flat, a visiting card from a Mr. Bra. Row of the firm Rowe and Aldgate, in the city, and on the back of it, in her father's hand, in the small, careful script he used for things he meant to be permanent. For Elspeth, if she returns, ask Mr. Rowe about the London letter. She took the card, she folded it inside her collar. With the cameo, oh... She went upstairs and rode in the cold of her room with her coat still on, a letter to the solicitor's office in London that she had written to once before, from Brussels, in her desperation. She sealed it with a wafer. She found in the desk, she set it on the mantelpiece. At 6 in the morning, before the kitchen maid had been to her room, but after she heard the girl moving below stairs, she went down and gave her the letter and a half-crown that represented more than half of what she had left, and she asked her to post it without telling Cecily or anyone else. The kitchen maid, whose name was Agnes, and who had let her in at the tradesman's door, on the first afternoon, with the uncomplicated generosity of someone who does not overthink things, said, "Yes, miss." In the morning, Marcus came to her door. He did not explain himself. He stood in the doorway for a moment and said, "I spent the night with the estate inventory ledger, not the one in the steward's office. The one in the library. She waited. There was a note. He said, in your father's handwriting. Accompanying the entry for the brooch, it read, given to my daughter Elspeth, on the occasion of her travel to the continent, that she may carry a piece of home with her and find her way back. He paused. It is dated October 12, 1810. The handwriting has been verified against 3 other documents I have that carry his signature. She said nothing. I have also found, he said, that 3 pages of the inheritance documentation have been removed from the folder. The cuts are consistent with scissors rather than a knife, suggesting someone with access to the household supplies. She reached into her collar and produced her father's visiting card. He read it. He read it again. He looked at her. I have sent a rider to Mr. Rowe, he said. He will arrive by noon. The drawing room was full when Mr. Pruse Rowe arrived, because Cecily had understood from the rider's departure that something was in motion and had assembled the previous evening's guests with the skill of a woman who has spent years turning public rooms to her advantage. Josiah was there. Lady Prescott was there, with her carrying voice and her talent for recording events for later distribution. The Fairfax family stood near the window, attentive and cautious. Cecily stood at the center of the room with her hands folded before her and her smile in place. It was a very good smile. Elspeth had come to understand this about it. The smile was not merely a performance. Cecily had worn it so long it had become a reflex, the body's automatic presentation of the face it had decided the world required. Mr. Brazen Rowe was a compact man of 50, with the brisk, unhurried efficiency of someone who has spent decades navigating the gap between what people want documents to say and what documents actually say. He greeted Marcus, greeted Elspeth with a direct and specific look that told her he had received at least one of her letters, and placed his leather case on the writing table. I will be brief, he said, as I understand the situation calls for clarity rather than ceremony. He opened the case. In the autumn of 1816, this office received a letter from Miss Ashmore, then residing in Brussels, inquiring after her father's estate and her own status as heir. That letter was intercepted, as I later discovered, before it reached me. A second letter, however, was sent by Miss Ashmore to a London solicitor, Mr. Hewitt of Gray's Inn, as a precaution. Mr. Hewitt contacted this office 3 days ago. Josiah shifted slightly. In his chair, his hands were on his knees. He looked at the space to Elspeth's left. Mr. Rowe continued. He laid out the packet from Mr. Hewitt. It contained Elspeth's letters, 6 of them across 6 years, each dated, each bearing the address of the Harcourt household in Brussels. He laid out testimony from Sir Gerald Harcourt, obtained by express, confirming Miss Ashmore's residence and service in his household from October of 1810 until September of 1816. He laid out last a letter from a Belgian magistrate, a different one from the same district as the one whose seal appeared on Cecily's document, stating that no such death registration existed in the district records, and that the seal on the document produced at the dinner of the previous evening bore a fraudulent copy, which had been out of use since 1814. The signature on Cecily's document had been forged. Josiah Frome read from a letter he had written to his own solicitor, read aloud by Mr. Brea. Rowe's assistant, with the flat voice of a man accustomed to reading difficult things without inflection. The ghost who walks back does not disturb the deed. Mr. Rowe laid the letter on the table beside the other documents, without comment. It was, he said, now in the possession of the county magistrate. The room was silent. Marcus had not moved during any of this. He stood beside the writing table where Mr. Reichst, Rowe had laid his case, and he held the estate inventory ledger open at the page he had found, and he waited until the last document had been read and the silence had fully settled. And then he stepped forward. He placed the ledger open on the table. Miss Elspeth Ashmore is alive, he said. She is the heir of Ashmore. 12 words, level, clear, addressed to no one in particular, and to everyone present. Cecily's smile stayed for one more breath after the words. The persistence of it was a thing to witness, the way the face clung to its practiced arrangement even as everything beneath it shifted. And then, as a face shifts when the person wearing it can no longer locate the next word, it simply went. She did not cry. She did not speak. She stood for a moment with her hands still folded before her, and her mouth in the slight open shape of someone mid-sentence who has forgotten what the sentence was meant to be, and then she turned and left the room quietly, as she had entered every room in this house for years, as though she had every right. Josiah was guided from the room a few minutes later by two men Elspeth did not know but who seemed to know what they were doing. Lady Prescott said, to no one in particular, in her carrying voice, "Well, I am glad she came back." There was no reference to ghosts. The guests departed. Mr. Rowe shook Elspeth's hand with the firm brevity of a man who has delivered good news before and knows that the person on the receiving end does not require a speech. He said he would begin the documentation in the morning. Marcus Vane, Viscount Ashmore, who was no longer Viscount of anything that was hers, looked at her across the empty room. "I owe you," he said, "a considerable debt of disbelief." "You owe me nothing," she said. "You looked at the evidence. That is all I asked." There was a pause in which neither of them moved. "I have been in this house 4 years," he said, "without knowing whose it was." "Now you know," she said. He said her name Elspeth just the once, quietly, as though he had been waiting to learn whether he had the right to use it. If those listening had thought he would say something more, they would have been disappointed. He did not say anything more. He simply stood in the empty drawing room with the inventory ledger in his hand, looking at her with those careful gray eyes in which something had recently and quietly unlocked. And she looked back at him, and the season outside the windows was October, gray and late, and somehow still carrying roses. She went to the schoolroom that evening as she had known she would. The house was finally quiet in the way of houses that have concluded something and have not yet decided what comes next. The fire had been lit downstairs. She could smell wood smoke and the faint pepper of the late outdoor cold brought in on someone's coat. She sat in the window seat and looked at the dark outside the glass. And she did not cry, because she had done her crying for this house and this life. In increments, across 6 years and a great deal of borrowed candlelight, and she had nothing left to spend that way. What she felt instead was something quieter and harder to name. It was the specific feeling of a room that remembers you, the odd comfort of a place that has held your shape in your absence without knowing it was doing so. She heard the door. He sat across from her in the old reading chair, the one she remembered her father using. And he set something on the windowsill between them, the cameo brooch. Small, oval, its ivory face worn to perfect smoothness by 6 years of hands in the dark. Cecily had placed it, during the confusion of the morning, in the drawer of the sideboard. She considered hers. He had retrieved it. He set it down without explanation or ceremony as one returns a thing to the shelf where it belongs. She picked it up. She held it in her palm for a moment, feeling the familiar weight, the familiar smoothness, the pin clasp her thumb knew how to find without looking. Then she set it on the ledge of the window seat, just beside the carved letters, "A," and she left her hand near it, in the way one leaves a hand near. Something precious, without quite closing the grip. He looked at the letters in the wood. He did not touch them. He simply looked, and in looking at them, she thought he understood something about the length of a person's life that cannot be documented, cannot be put in a folder, cannot be removed with scissors. The simple, indelible fact of being. Outside the window, October moved through the late roses. The sky had cleared at some point during the evening, and there were stars now, cold and specific, the kind that burn longer and quieter than anyone expects. "Elspeth," he said. Just the once, her name, in his voice, in her own schoolroom in the house her father built. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the carved letters held between them everything she had never needed to say. If this story moved you, leave a word below. She waited long enough. She deserves to be remembered. The brooch stayed on the ledge all night, beside her name in the wood, and by morning neither of them had needed to move it elsewhere.